for this webinar on an orientation to literary theory. It's a moment of great privilege to extend a hearty welcome to a renowned and resourceful speaker, Professor Joseph Dorairaj, Dean of the School of English and Foreign Languages at Gandhigram Rural Institute, Gandhigram, Tamil Nadu. During 2013 to 2014, he was the Vice Chancellor of Gandhigram Rural University. He was a Fulbrighter in 2014 and visited educational institutions in Washington, D.C., New York, and Miami, and also an Erasmus Mundus visiting scholar in KU, Leuven, Belgium in 2015. He conducted a month-long teacher training program in Kandy, Sri Lanka in August 2007. He has also visited Georgian University, Rome, Radboud University, the Netherlands, and Center Serves Paris. He has published 50 articles and authored 4 books, namely Myth and Literature in 2006, Interventions, Essay in Philosophy and Literary Theory 2011, Philosophical Hermeneutics in 2015, and FAQs on Research, Literature and Language in 2019. He has edited 2 books, namely Critical Essays on Indian English Poets in 2015 and Essays on Gandhi in 2019. He has successfully guided 14 PhD candidates and has educated more than 90 PhD theses. He was a visiting professor of philosophy at Satya Nilayam, affiliated to Madras University from 2009 to 2012, and a visiting professor of English at Osmania University in 2016. He is the founder editor of Gandhigram Literary Review. He is an assessor for NAC since 2010 and was involved in the preparation of NAC's revised methodology. He has assessed 31 colleges and universities all over the country and also went to 13 colleges as chairperson for NAC peer team. Still, sir, lies ahead to achieve in the field of literature. Hearty welcome to you, sir. I take
Thank you.
in welcoming our secretary, Reverend Sister Dr. Krishna Andoni Sami, whose support has guided us through long ways. I also welcome an unanimous supporter and the strongest pillar, the principal of Holy Cross College, Reverend Sister Dr. Christina Bridget, for always rendering us this platform to explore and discover new things. I extend a cordial welcome to the head of the Department of English, Reverend Sister Dr. Judy Gomes, a strong reinforcer who guards and guides us in gaining knowledge as a lifelong journey. I render a genial welcome to our professors of the Department of English who have always been a vital supporters in imparting knowledge to the younger generations. I would like to express my appreciation and welcome all the participants from various colleges, and I hope you will take the best that you can from this webinar and let the purpose be a fruitful one. Once again, I welcome you all.
Thank you, ma'am, for your words of welcome. Words of wisdom and experience enrich and enlighten minds to greater parts of success. We are happy to have an eminent person as our chief guest, Professor A. Joseph Dorairaj, Professor of English and the School of English and Foreign Languages, Gandhigram Rural Institute, Dindigul, to share his experience and knowledge on literary theory.
Sir, you can present.
I will start.
Yes, sir.
Okay, is my voice audible? Is my voice clear?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. So I'll share my screen. Is my screen visible? Is my screen visible?
Yes, sir.
No, sir.
It's visible.
Are you able?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Oh, it's visible.
It's visible.
Okay, so my voice is audible. My voice is clear. My voice is
Very
audible.
much. Very
Okay,
much,
fine.
sir.
Okay, thank you. I'll start. Okay, good evening, dear friends. Reverend Sister Secretary of Holy Cross College, Trichy. Reverend Sister Principal, Reverend Dr. Christina Bridget, the Principal of Holy Cross College. Reverend Dr. Judy Gomez, the Head of the Department of English at Holy Cross College, Trichy. The organizer of this event, Dr. Onita. Other professors in the Department of English at Holy Cross College, Trichy. And dear friends, good evening to all of you. At the outset, I would like to thank the head of the Department of English at Holy Cross, Sister Judy Gomez, for having invited me to talk on literary theory. But I would like to not only thank, but also appreciate the organizer of the program, Dr. Onita, for a very simple reason. She was persistent. Till I said yes, she didn't leave me. And she kept on calling me till she got a yes from me. She persisted with her phone calls. I really appreciate this gesture. So dear friends, I'm happy to meet you online, and I'll be talking about an orientation to theory. So that is the first part of my title. The second part of my title is classical and modern. So which means I'll be talking about literary theory from a classical perspective, and that would constitute the first part of my presentation. And in the second part of my presentation, I'll be talking about theory. I'll be talking about literary theory from a modern and contemporary perspective. So this is how I have divided my presentation: an orientation to theory, the classical perspective, and an orientation to theory, a modern and a contemporary perspective. Now, dear friends, particularly as students of English literature, all of us are very familiar with this literary giant M.H. Abrams, because as students of literature, particularly at the undergraduate level, we are very familiar, we are quite conversant with M.H. Abrams' book, A Glossary of Literary Terms. Now, in addition to a glossary of literary terms, M.H. Abrams, who lived for more than 100 years, in fact, he passed away only in 2015, only some 5 years ago, he has written some important books, that is, apart from a glossary of literary terms, with which we are all very familiar and conversant. In 1953, M.H. Abrams wrote a very important book on the romantic theory of poetry, and the title of the book is The Mirror and the Lamp. This was in 1953, and the subtitle of this book is Romantic Theory and the Critical Tradition. So the main title of the book is The Mirror and the Lamp. I'll be drawing heavily from this particular book. Then the other books written by M.H. Abrams, in 1971, he came up with another fantastic book with the title Naturalism and Supernaturalism. In 1991, his book with the title Doing Things with Text was published. And as students of literature, we all know that the Norton Anthology of British Literature was edited by M.H. Abrams. He was the chief editor of the Norton Anthology of English Literature. Now, dear friends, as I said earlier, The Mirror and the Lamp, a book on romantic theory of poetry that was published in 1953. And this book won many awards. But anyway, I am not going to talk about that dimension. I would like to focus on the first chapter of the book, The Mirror and the Lamp, written by M.H. Abrams and published in the year 1953. So the first chapter, the title of the first chapter is An Orientation to Theory. I repeat, The Mirror and the Lamp is the book, published in 1953, and the first chapter is Orientation of Critical Theories. I repeat, The first chapter of The Mirror and the Lamp is titled Orientation of Critical Theories. And this particular chapter is divided into two parts. In the first part of the chapter, M.H. Abrams talks about the four coordinates of criticism. You can see it on the slide, the very first line. So in the first part of the chapter, titled Orientation of Critical Theories, M.H. Abrams talks about the coordinates of criticism. And what exactly does he mean by the term coordinates? The pillars of criticism or the foundation of criticism. Let us use the word coordinates or pillars. So therefore, the key question is, what according to M.H. Abrams is the foundation of criticism? What according to M.H. Abrams are the pillars of criticism? What according to M.H. Abrams are the coordinates of criticism? Please remember, he uses the word the coordinates. I replace the word coordinates with pillars, foundation. So the question is, what are the four coordinates of criticism? As you see it on the screen, the four coordinates or the four pillars of criticism according to M.H. Abrams are: number one, the universe; number two, the work, the literary work, the poem, the novel, the drama, the short story. Then at the bottom, on one side, you have the author, you have the artist, the poet, the playwright, the novelist, the short story writer. Then on the other side, you have the reader, you have the audience. Okay, so dear friends, the four pillars or the four coordinates of criticism according to M.H. Abrams in his book The Mirror and the Lamp, published in 1953, are the universe, also known as reality. So the universe, the literary work, the author or the artist, the reader or the audience. So this is what M.H. Abrams talks about in the first part of the chapter. In the second part of the chapter, he talks about four literary theories that correspond to these four coordinates. In other words, in the first part of the chapter, he talks about the four pillars of criticism or the four coordinates of criticism. Now, each coordinate or each pillar, what would be the corresponding literary theory? And this is discussed in the second part of the chapter. So therefore, what are the four literary theories? So universe would be one of the four coordinates or one of the four pillars of criticism. So universe, corresponding to universe or life or reality, we have the mimetic theory of literature. So universe and the mimetic theory of literature, they go together. Then at the heart of the triangular structure, at the heart of the schema, you have the literary work, the poem, the novel, the drama, the short story. And corresponding to the literary work, you have the formalistic theory of literature. And I'll be very briefly talking about the formalistic theory of literature, both the Russian formalistic theory and also the Anglo-American formalistic theory. Now at the bottom, on one side, you have the coordinate, namely the author or the artist, the poet, the playwright, the novelist, and the literary theory that is associated with the author. The literary theory that corresponds to the author or the artist is the expressive theory of art, the expressive theory of literature. And the final coordinate or the final pillar is the reader or the audience. And associated with the reader or corresponding to the reader or the audience, we have the pragmatic theory of art, we have the pragmatic theory of literature. So which means we have four coordinates or we have four pillars of criticism, and associated with these four coordinates of criticism or these four pillars of criticism, we have four literary theories or four artistic theories. So universe, the mimetic theory of art; the literary work, the formalistic theory of art; the author, the expressive theory of art; the reader or the audience, and we have the pragmatic theory of art. So this is what M.H. Abrams does in the first chapter of his book, The Mirror and the Lamp, which was published in 1953. Now what I'll do for the next 8 to 10 minutes is, very briefly talk about each of the four literary theories, namely the mimetic theory of literature, the formalistic theory of literature, the expressive theory of literature, and the pragmatic theory of literature. Now, what is this mimetic theory of literature? Now, as students of literature, we are all very familiar with the mimetic theory of literature. As we all know, if we analyze the root word or the etymology, we end up with the Greek word mimesis, M-I-M-E-S-I-S. Mimesis is a Greek word which means imitation. So what is this mimetic theory? The mimetic theory of art or the mimetic theory of literature talks about art or talks about literature as an imitation of life, as a reflection of life, as a representation of life. Now, there is an interesting question. Who talked about the mimetic theory of art? Who pioneered? Who was the first one to talk about the mimetic theory of art? Now we have to go back to Plato and Aristotle. It was Plato who in his dialogues first talked about art as mimesis or as an imitation of life or as a representation of life or as a reflection of life. Now very briefly about Plato. Who is Plato and what did he write? Now as we all know, Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher. His guru was Socrates and his Shishya, his disciple was Aristotle. So that is the lineage. And what is the book that Plato wrote? Plato wrote what is called the Dialogues. And the title is Dialogues of Plato. And we have hundreds of dialogues, some short, some long. And for students of literature, for us, the most important dialogue is the Republic. The Republic itself is more than one book. It is a very long dialogue. Now, what exactly do we mean by a dialogue? As we all know, a dialogue is a conversation. When I talk to my wife, when I talk to my daughter, when I talk to my colleague, I am entering into a dialogue. So in the dialogues of Plato, we have two persons, we have two individuals. On the one hand, we have Socrates, the learned guru, and on the other side, we have a young Athenian, a young man from Athens. So this is the dialogue. So the constant person is Socrates. The young man from Athens, that varies, that differs from dialogue to dialogue. Now it is Plato in his Republic, one of his dialogues, talks about the mimetic theory of art. Now what exactly did Plato mean by art as mimesis? Now a little bit of Platonic metaphysics and epistemology. Metaphysics in philosophy would be a theory or a study of being as being, and epistemology in philosophy would mean theory of knowledge. Now, according to Plato, this world, the world that we exist in, the world that you and I operate in, according to Plato, this is not the real world. So the real world exists elsewhere, and Plato would argue that it is governed by a demiurge, something like a god, maybe a minor god. So that is the real world. That is the ideal world. And the world that we are living in is only an imitation of the real world or the ideal world. Okay, so which means on my table I have an apple. Okay, so this is only an imitation. The original apple exists elsewhere. So what I have on my table and what I'm going to eat immediately after the presentation, so that is not a real apple in Platonic philosophical theory. That is only an imitation of the real apple that exists elsewhere. Now my friend who is an artist, who is a painter, what does he do? He draws or he produces a painting of this apple. So Plato would say, my dear friend, you have produced an imitation of an imitation. Okay, now dear friends, I'll give you a very simple example. Now I have a book. The title of the book is The Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism, or let me take a simple book. Okay, The Palace of Illusions by Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni. So I have the original book. I have bought it from a bookstore. Now, one of my students wants to do a project. So what does he or she do? She takes the book and makes a Xerox copy or a photocopy. And some other student is interested in reading this book. So what does he or she do? She collects the photocopy, and from the photocopy, from the Xerox copy, makes another photocopy. So which means I have the original. So the first photocopy or the first Xerox copy is once removed from reality, and the second version, a photocopy of the photocopy, is twice removed from reality. I repeat, the original book is with me. When you make the first Xerox copy, when you make the first photocopy, that is once removed from reality because it is an imitation of the original. When you make a second Xerox copy, when you make a second photocopy, what you're doing is you're producing an imitation of an imitation. So that is why, referring to art, particularly poetry, Plato would argue in a disparaging tone that art is an imitation of an imitation. It is twice removed from reality. It is in this context that Plato introduces the term mimesis, a Greek word which means imitation. So what is this mimetic theory of art? What is this mimetic theory of literature? It talks about literature as an imitation of life, literature as a reflection of life, literature as a representation of life. Now, not only Plato, but Aristotle also has talked about the mimetic theory of art. Now that I have talked about the mimetic theory of art, let me go to the second theory of literature, namely the formalistic theory. Formalism. Okay, so formalism. And we have two varieties or two schools of formalism, namely the Russian school of formalism, and we also have the British, the American. Together it is called the Anglo-American school of formalism. Now, before I talk about very briefly the Russian school and the Anglo-American school, let me talk about what is this formalism. Now look at the word formalism. You cut out the suffix, you take the stem, you take the root word. It talks about form. So in other words, as students of literature, when I read a poem, when I read a novel, when I read a drama, when I read a short story, I have two options. What are the two options? I can look at the content. If it is a short story, I can look at the story part. If it is a novel, I can look at the story part. Now, the second option is I can also look at the form, the language, the style, the narrative pattern, the narrative structure. So which means, as students of literature, either we look at the content, the storyline, the substance, the matter, or we look at the form, the language, the presentation, the narrative mode. But then these are like two sides of the coin. I cannot separate or divorce form from content and content from form. So these are like two sides of the coin. On one side, you have the content, you have the story, you have the matter, you have the material. And on the other side, you have the form, the language, the presentation, the style, the narrative structure. So these are like two sides of the coin. Now, what is this formalism? As the word suggests, as the word signifies, you pay more attention to form rather than the content. Not that you neglect the content, not that you brush aside the content totally. Content matters. But then more than the content, according to the formalists, it is the way in which, it is the manner in which, it is the mode in which the content is presented, the material is presented. So therefore, the formalists are those who focus on the form, more on the form and less on the content. And we have two schools. We have the Russian school and we have the Anglo-American school. Both schools have similar ideas, maybe not identical ideas, not exactly the same ideas. They have similar ideas, but then we have to note that these ideas were developed independently. The Russian school, okay, so we have people like Eichenbaum, Jakobson, Okay, so these are the two famous people. Then when we come to the Anglo-American Formalism, also known as the New Criticism, okay, we have people like John Crow Ransom. In fact, he wrote a book, New Criticism, and that is how this particular school got the title, the New Criticism. Okay. Now, what exactly is this formalism? Or I will reframe my question. What was the agenda of the formalistic school? What was the motto of the formalistic school? Okay, I'll give you two answers. Okay, the motto of the formalistic school, particularly the Anglo-American school, also known as the New Criticism, was words on the page. I repeat, what was the motto? What was the clarion call of the new critics or the Anglo-American formalists? We are not interested in the biography of the author. Was the author a white or a non-white? Was the author a man or a woman? Was the author a Democrat or a Republican? Now that American presidential elections are going on. Was the author a modernist or a conservative? So they said, we are not interested in the biography of the author. We don't even want to know the name of the author because that would influence our reading and our interpretation. What matters to us is the text and only the text. The poem, qua poem, the Latin expression QUA. So in other words, the formalists, the new critics, they made it very clear. What matters to them is words on the page. Look at the preposition, words on the page, not behind the page. When we say behind the page, it would mean the biography of the author or the context, the cultural context, the social context, the political context in which the work was written. So they said, we are not interested in the extrinsic approach to literature. We are not interested in background criticism. What matters to us is words on the page. And this was their motto, this was their clarion call, this was their proclamation, and their reading strategy was close reading, minute reading, practical criticism, in other words. And in fact, that was one of the books written by I.A. Richards, one of the founders of the New Criticism. Okay, so dear friends, I have talked about the mimetic theory of art. The mimetic theory of art talks about art or literature as imitation of life. The formalistic theory focuses more on the form and less on the content, and they focus on the words on the page, not behind the page. Now let us come to the expressive theory. Now I am sure you're all familiar with Wordsworth's theory of poetry. In fact, Wordsworth wrote only one essay, and at least at the conceptual level, it was a collaboration between Wordsworth and Coleridge, but the actual writing was done by Wordsworth. Preface to Lyrical Ballads, because Lyrical Ballads was an anthology of poems written jointly by Wordsworth and Coleridge. So Preface to Lyrical Ballads, a theoretical justification of the choice of the subjects in lyrical ballads and also the use of language in the lyrical ballads. So that was Preface to Lyrical Ballads. And one important section in lyrical ballads is Wordsworth raises two questions. What is poetry? How do we define poetry? And he gives us two answers: the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions recollected in tranquility. Now, I am not interested in that. Now, what is interesting to me is the question, who is a poet? What is a poet? Is a poet like any other human being, or is a poet blessed with, endowed with very special capacities and capabilities? In other words, during the Romantic Age, the 18th century, the 19th century, and that was also the advent of psychology and maybe a little bit of neuroscience, critics, readers and critics were interested in the poet and the working or the operation of the poetic mind. So how does the mind of a poet work? In what way, in what manner, in what fashion is it different from the other minds A normal mind and a creative mind, what would be the differences? How does a normal mind work? How does the poetic mind work? So this was the expressive theory. So the expressive theory sought to throw light on the working or the operation of the creative mind, the poetic mind. In fact, you go back to the title of the book by M.H. Abrams, published in 1953. The title of the book is The Mirror and the Lamp. So he uses two metaphors. Mirror is a metaphor and lamp is another metaphor. What does the mirror do? The mirror reflects. That is the mimetic theory of art, a reflection of life. What does the lamp do? Particularly in a dark environment, in a dark space where there is no electricity. So when you light a lamp, what happens? It throws light, it sheds light. So the expressive theory, using the metaphor of the lamp, wants to shed light or wants to throw light on the working, on the operation of a poet's mind or a creative mind. So dear friends, I have talked about the mimetic theory. I have also talked about the formalistic theory and the expressive theory. So what is left is the pragmatic theory. So what is this pragmatic theory? Now, pragmatic theory talks about the effect or the impact of art on the reader, on the audience. I repeat, it talks about the influence, the effect, the impact. When you read a poem, what happens to you? When I watch a Shakespearean tragedy, when I watch a Greek tragedy, what happens to me? When I watch a film, what is its impact on me? So that would be the pragmatic theory. And when we talk about the pragmatic theory, we need to talk about 4 dimensions. I will go through them quickly. Now, once again, we go back to Plato and Aristotle. Now, Plato addressed this question. What is the end of art? End here means goal, objective. Why do we read literature? Okay, for what purpose? What is its effect on us? So Plato, answering the question, what is the end of art? What is the goal of art? Would argue it is moralistic or it is didactic. Art should instill values in the reader. Watching a drama should instill some good values in the minds of the audience. So this was Plato, the moralistic dimension or the didactic dimension. Aristotle, who was Plato's student, because Aristotle, till Plato's death, studied in the academy founded by Plato. After Plato's death, he left the academy, he went back to his own place and he started his own school, and Alexander the Great was his student. Anyway, that's a different story. Okay, so Aristotle, answering the same question, what is the end of art? What is the goal of art? He would argue it is aesthetic. What does he mean by aesthetic? Now we know in India the lockdown has been partially lifted and theaters have been open. So why do people go to the theater? For 6 months, for 7 months, we have been cloistered, we have been cooped up in the house, so we need some fresh air, so we go to the theater for some fun, for some enjoyment, for some relaxation, for some entertainment. This is what Aristotle meant by the aesthetic dimension of art. So on one extreme we have Plato, who talked about the moralistic or the didactic dimension of art. On the other end we have Aristotle, who talks about the aesthetic dimension, and we know the truth is somewhere in between. So we need to combine, or we need to synthesize the Platonic and the Aristotelian dimensions, and that was done by Horace, Horace. This is for the students. So Horace wrote a long poem called Ars Poetica. There he argues, talking about the objective of art, the objective of literature, objective of poetry. He uses a Latin expression which is dulce et utile, et, etc. and dulce, dulcet. We have the English word dulcet, which means sweet. Utile, utility, utilitarianism, useful. So in other words, he says Plato is right, Aristotle also is right. So what does great art do? Even as it entertains you, even as you derive enjoyment out of reading a poem or watching a drama, you also imbibe certain values, and this is the hallmark, as we all know, of great literature. So, dear friends, I have taken quite some time. So, M.H. Abrams, in his book The Mirror and the Lamb, published in 1953, in the first chapter, which is titled Orientation of Critical Theories, in the first part of the chapter, he talks about the four coordinates or the four pillars of criticism, and they are the universe, the work, the author or the artist, the reader or the audience. And in the second part of the chapter, he talks about four literary theories, four artistic theories that correspond to these four coordinates, namely the Mimetic Theory, the Formalistic Theory, the Expressive Theory, and the Pragmatic Theory. Now, this is the last slide for the first part of my presentation. Now, if you look at, because the title of my presentation is an orientation to theory, the classical perspective, and orientation to theory, the modern perspective. So, if you take the classical perspective or the traditional perspective, it was founded on, it was built on, it was established on 5 key assumptions. You call them basic assumptions or you call them underpinnings. And you look at the title, Anglo-American criticism. Anglo would be British and American would be North American. So together, Anglo-American criticism. This is also known as liberal humanism or a liberal humanistic perspective. So I will quickly go through it. So the first one, till some 30, 40, 50 years ago, people, students, teachers, professors, editors, they did not have any confusion whatsoever regarding what is literature and what is non-literature. So there were very clear notions about literature. So this was till cultural studies arrived, till feminism arrived, till post-structuralism arrived. So prior to that, okay, so what was literature? This is literature, this is not literature. So the line of demarcation was clear. So the first assumption is there were definite and clear notions about literature. But today, do we have clear notions about literature? No, we do not have clear notions about literature. Why? If you are a student of cultural studies, you would argue Shakespeare's Macbeth is a literary text, and Harold Bloom would argue Batman comics are also treated as part of literature, and that is his complaint or grouse against cultural studies. Okay, so which means earlier what constituted literature, they were clear about it, but today we are not very clear. Not that we are not very clear. The definition of literature, the boundaries of what constituted literature, they have been expanded, as a result of which we accommodate everything. Shakespeare is literature, Jane Austen is literature, Jayakanthan is literature, but Ambuli Mama also is literature. Comics are also literature. Serials are also literature. So today we have a very broad notion of literature. Classical, clear ideas. Modern, the notion of literature is broad. Now the second one, earlier it was abundantly clear. You have a poet, you have a critic. I repeat, you have a creative writer and you have a critic. So the question is, who is primary and who is secondary? Without batting an eyelid, people would answer, yes, of course, the poet is superior to the critic. It is the poet first and the critic next. In other words, only when the poet writes something does the critic have some work to do. If the poet goes on a holiday, or if the poet falls sick, or if the poet refuses to write, saying that I have a headache or I have a stomachache, then what happens to the critic? The critic has to patiently wait. So this was traditional criticism. So traditionally, criticism was subservient and secondary to literature, inferior to literature. But today, modern criticism, contemporary criticism would argue there is no question of who is inferior and who is superior. I will talk about it a little later. So today, if I am a critic, what would I tell you? Okay, if my friend writes a poem, I will write a commentary. I will write my reflections. I will write my review. If my friend goes on a holiday, don't think I will be jobless. I'll be writing an essay on hermeneutics. I'll be writing an essay on myth criticism. I'll be writing an essay on modern criticism. So in other words, in modern criticism, the critique is no more secondary or subservient or inferior in any way to the creative author. Number three, the third major assumption of traditional criticism is it is author-centered. You take a poem, you take a novel, you take a drama, you take a short story. You have to talk about the author. You have to talk about the authorial intention. What was on the mind of the author when he wrote the poem? What was on the mind of the author when he composed the short story? In other words, the meaning of the text, the meaning of the poem, the meaning of the novel, the meaning of the short story is to be squarely identified with the author's intention, also known as the authorial intention. This is traditional criticism, classical criticism. But in modern criticism, we have the death of the author. We pronounce, we declare the death of the author, and then we say the text is autonomous, the text is independent, about which I will talk a little later. So number four, traditional criticism would tell you, here is a text, here is a poem, here is a novel, here is the short story. If you know how to read, if you are familiar with the methodology of reading, if you are familiar with the pedagogy of reading, if you have this reading competence, if you have this hermeneutic competence, you will know how to read the text and access and retrieve and recover the meaning of the text, which is to be identified with the authorial intention. So therefore, traditional criticism would tell you, if only you approach the text, the literary text properly, with the proper protocols, with the proper reading strategies, with the proper reading methodologies, you will surely discover the meaning embedded in the text. Whereas a person like Derrida, a person like Harold Bloom, or a person like Paul Deman would say, however hard you try, however competent you may be as a reader, you will never discover the meaning in the text. Not your problem, not your fault. That is the nature of the text. So deconstruction would tell you the text is slippery, the signified is absent, whereas traditional criticism would tell you there is a meaning in the text, and if you approach it properly, you are sure to identify the meaning, you are sure to locate the meaning, and you are sure to retrieve the meaning. And the last point is about language. Traditional criticism, particularly with reference to mimesis, would argue language is a transparent medium. Language is a diaphanous medium. Okay, if I want to convey something, I use language to convey my thoughts, my ideas, my emotions, because language is a tool, an instrument. The instrumental theory of language. Okay, so whereas after Sassoo, post Sassoo, Sassoo is the father of modern linguistics, and his book is a course in general linguistics, which was published in 1916. So after Sassoo, post Sassoo, we say language is no more a transparent medium. We cannot rely on language. We cannot depend on language. So dear friends, these are the 5 basic assumptions or underpinnings of traditional criticism. And I have also pointed out how there is a huge difference as far as these 5 assumptions are concerned between traditional criticism, between classical criticism on the one hand, and modern criticism on the other. So that is the first part of my presentation. Now we need to talk about the transition from the classical times to the modern times, from the classical theory of literature to the modern theory of literature, from the classical notions of criticism to modern notions of criticism. Now some students would ask me, when did all this happen? Is there any timeline? Are there landmarks? Are there milestones? Now, as students of literature, particularly when you do this history of English literature or any literature, we know years are only indicators, years are only markers, not that on one fine day there was this transition. No, this happens over a period of time. So I would like to point out 5 landmarks or 5 markers. These are only markers. Okay, fine. So in other words, to sum it up, 1960s would be considered as the watershed. So that suggested or that signified the break. So prior to 1960, we have the traditional criticism or we have classical criticism. After 1960, we have modern criticism and contemporary criticism. So what exactly happened? Reading. So I would recommend this essay. So please read it. Am I audible? Dear friends, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine.
Yes.
So in 1959, we have the translation of Sassoo's book, A Course in General Linguistics. Now, please remember, Sassoo taught at the University of Geneva in Switzerland. He was a Swiss by birth and he spoke French. So he died in 1913. So 3 years after his death, his students put together the class notes and they edited a book with the title, A Course in General Linguistics, and it was in French. And the English translation appeared only in 1959, and the translation was done by Wade Baskin. Now, in 1983, there was another translation, and that was by Roy Harris. So, why is this important? Because we talk of structuralism, post-structuralism, deconstruction, they all derive their basis or their foundation from Sassoo. And even though Sassoo's book in French came out in 1916, the English-speaking world was not aware of Sassoo and Sassoo's theories till 1950 and the early 60s because they waited for the English translation. So it was only in the 1960s that the English-speaking countries came to know about Sassoo. And the next landmark is in 1964, we have the establishment of the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. Originally, it was part of the Department of English and part of an extension of the Adult Education Department. As we all know, Richard Hoggett was the first director and Stuart Hall was the second director. In fact, he was a director for 10 long years, and it was during Hall's tenure, Stuart Hall's tenure, that the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies established itself. And in 1966, we all know what happened in Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore. They had an international seminar, Languages of Criticism and Sciences of Man. Jacques Derrida presents a paper, Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, where he announced, where he declared the death of structuralism. And the following year, we have Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author. So, dear friends, I have given you 5 landmarks, 5 markers, and these are important because each event, each publication was something like a tectonic shift. If I can use that metaphor, it shook up the critical edifice or the critical foundation or the critical building, and it engineered, it brought in, it introduced new theories and insights. Now that I have talked about an orientation to theory from a classical perspective, and I have also given you 5 major assumptions or underpinnings of traditional criticism or classical criticism, and I have also noted the passing or the transition from classical to modern. Let me talk about 7 major insights, 7 major theories of modern criticism. I'll go through it quickly. Now, the first major insight in modern literary theory or in contemporary literary theory is this. Let me read it out. Theory is no more subservient to literature. It is no more the handmaiden to literature. I'm sure you will remember this. I want you to recall this. When I talked about the 5 major assumptions of traditional criticism, when I talked about the underpinnings of traditional criticism, one of the issues was I made it very clear. who is primary and who is secondary, who is superior and who is inferior. So traditional criticism makes it abundantly clear. The poet is superior, the poet is primary, or the novelist is primary, the playwright is primary, the critic is secondary, because the critic is dependent on the creative writer. If the creative writer doesn't write anything, then the critic has no job. He is unemployed. He or she is unemployed. So therefore, in traditional criticism, creative writing was primary and critical activity was secondary. But modern criticism makes it very clear. There is no question of which is primary and which is secondary. There is no question of which is superior and which is inferior. Both enjoy an equal status, equal footing. Okay, writer is primary, so is the critic. Now, recently I was attending a webinar, and this was about translation. Now, the translator made a similar remark. No, the translator is not inferior. Not that the writer is superior and the translator is inferior. She refused to accept that the translator is inferior. No. In fact, that particular translator, she's from Kerala, she added an argument. The writer is only monolingual. She can write only in Malayalam, whereas I can write in Malayalam and I can also write in English. So in a sense, I am superior to the writer. Anyway, that is another story. So here, modern criticism makes it very clear that criticism is no more inferior, no more subservient, or no more subsidiary to literature. It doesn't play the role of the handmaiden to literature. It is in this connection that Lévi-Strauss gives an interesting analogy. He talks about bricolage. Okay, and critics say bricolage is a French word which resists translation. Okay, so if at all you want to translate it into English, you say like, make do with whatever is available. Okay, so he makes a distinction between the writer and the critic, and the analogy that he gives is the engineer and the bricklayer. On the analogy of the writer, he coins bricolage and bricolayer. So he says, as the writer is to the critic, the engineer is to the bricolayer. Anyway, I don't have time to expand on this, but the first idea is very clear. Traditional criticism makes it very clear. Oh, you are a critic, you have an inferior role to play. But modern criticism makes it very clear. You are a critic, you are as good as the writer. Because today the critic says, if you write something, I will write a commentary, I will write a review, I will produce an exegesis, or I will produce a hermeneutical reading of the text. If you don't write, on my own, I can write on some theory, I can write on some concept. So therefore, the critic is no more inferior. Now, the second point, as I said, I have 7 points to discuss. I have already discussed 1 point, so 6 points to be discussed here. So the second one, now at the MPhil level and also the PhD level, primarily at the MA level also, many students find modern criticism, modern literary theory daunting, challenging, difficult. Okay, so they say, oh, criticism is very difficult. Roland Barthes is difficult. Derrida is difficult. New historicism is difficult. Okay, narratology is difficult. Okay, fine. Now, as a teacher and as a student of literary theory, as an ardent student of literary theory, because I love talking about literary theory, I love teaching literary theory, and I also love the challenge of writing about literary theory, I wouldn't call it difficult. Instead, I would call it challenging. So therefore, the question is, why is modern theory or why is contemporary theory daunting, challenging, difficult? Now, the answer is very simple. It is multidisciplinary. In other words, without a good background or without a good grounding or a proper grounding in linguistics, particularly Sassoorian linguistics, you simply cannot understand or comprehend structuralism, post-structuralism, and deconstruction. Because basically structuralism and deconstruction would argue the signifier is in pursuit of the signified, but the union never happens, as a result of which meaning can never be arrived at. I have summarized post-structuralism in 2 sentences. Now, I have used terms like signifier. What is a signifier? What is a signified? What is the signification? What is its politics of signification? Now, in order to understand this against the backdrop of post-structuralism and deconstruction, you should know your Sassoo. You should know Sassoo's course in general linguistics. So without a proper grounding in linguistics, particularly Sassoorian linguistics is also known as structural linguistics. You cannot understand post-structuralism or deconstruction. So therefore, you need to equip yourself with the knowledge of one more subject, namely linguistics. Now, what about anthropology and sociology? If you want to do cultural studies, you should have some background in anthropology and sociology. So without knowing what culture is, without knowing terms like thick description, which Clifford Geertz uses, or social capital, which Pierre Bourdieu uses, you cannot understand cultural studies. Okay, so which means as a student of modern theory, as a student of contemporary theory, in addition to your literature, in addition to your traditional literary theory and criticism, you should be familiar, you should be conversant with linguistics, with anthropology, with sociology, and more importantly, with philosophy. I will ask a very simple question. Now, if you take modern literary criticism, one of the stars, one of the giants of modern literary criticism is Derrida. Now, Derrida is not a poet. He is not a playwright. He is not a filmmaker. Who is he? He is a philosopher. So you go to his Of Grammatology. If you don't know your philosophy, particularly if you do not have a good orientation and a good grounding in metaphysics, then you will find it very difficult to understand Derrida's major book, Derrida's seminal work Of Grammatology, which was translated from French into English by Gayatri Spivak. I'll give you one more example. You go to postmodernism. The most important text is the Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge. The original version came out in 1979 and the English translation in 1984. Who is this? Who is this Lyotard? Was he a playwright? Was he a critic? No, he was a political philosopher. So in other words, without philosophy, you cannot understand modern criticism or contemporary criticism. And that is the reason why quite a few universities in India, quite a few universities in Tamil Nadu, particularly South India, have introduced philosophy as an elective paper. For instance, Bharathidasan University, Trichy, they have a paper on philosophy. I don't remember the exact title, introduced by Professor Noel. In my own university, Gandhigram University, we have a 4-credit paper on Introduction to Western Philosophy. And now during this lockdown period, quite a few institutions organized webinars on philosophy, introducing students to the major concepts and the fundamental theories of Western philosophy. So philosophy is very important, and so are gender studies and psychoanalysis. In other words, when students complain, some teachers also complain that modern theory, contemporary theory, post-structuralism, postmodernism, new historicism, they are daunting, they are difficult. The reason is obvious. If you are confined to literature and literary criticism, obviously you will find them difficult. So therefore, expand your horizon, expand your perimeter, okay? Acquire some knowledge of linguistics, a little bit of anthropology, a little bit of sociology, have a good grounding in Western philosophy, some gender studies and some psychoanalysis, then you will be in a position to not read, but attack modern and contemporary theory. Now, the third point is there cannot be any disinterested inquiry. Now, when I was a student, that was 30, 35 years ago, we were told, who is a good critic? What are the characteristics of a good critic? What are the hallmarks of a good critic? A good critic should be neutral. A good critic should be non-partisan, should be objective, should not take sides. In other words, disinterested, the term that Matthew Arnold used, a disinterested inquiry. So disinterested is not the opposite of interested. So interested, the opposite is uninterested. So disinterested means neutral, non-partisan. But today, modern criticism and modern theory will ask you, how is it possible to be disinterested? How is it possible to have an innocuous look or an innocent reading? I am a man. So therefore, willy-nilly, with my knowledge or without my knowledge, my reading will be at least to some extent androcentric. If you are a woman, even if you try to be conscious of your gender, your gendered identity, your reading willy-nilly will be a gendered reading, a feminist reading, maybe not a rabid feminist reading, but at least to some extent. Okay, I am an Indian. I belong to, I speak a particular language, I profess a particular religion. So which means all these are there at the back of my mind. Okay, so how do you expect me to put away all these things and look at the text in a neutral way? So it is not possible. So therefore, while traditional criticism argued that a critic should be disinterested, reading should be neutral, reading should be innocent, innocuous, innocent in the sense non-political, non-ideological, modern theory makes it very clear. Ideology is pervasive. All reading is political. All reading is ideological. All reading is gendered. And when you talk of ideology, how do we define ideology? Marx would famously define ideology as false consciousness, and Antonio Gramsci in his Prison Notes would talk of hegemony, which is domination by consent or manufactured consent, and Althusser, while talking of ideology, would talk of the repressive state apparatuses like the prison, like the court of law, and the ideological state apparatuses like educational institutions, places of worship, families. So in other words, the third point is, you cannot have a neutral reading. You cannot have an objective reading. Objectivity is a myth. Objectivity is an illusion. You ask women, you ask feminists, they would argue all reading is gender. All reading is political. All reading is ideological. Now, the fourth point is theory has announced the death of the author. We are already very familiar with it because one of the most important essays of the second half of the 20th century is the essay by Roland Barthes, written in 1967, The Death of the Author. Okay, and in 1971, he wrote another text, From Work to Author. So he says, you don't use the term work. Instead, you use text. So what is the difference between work and text? Work has only one meaning, whereas a text has many meanings. It is polysemic, it is polysemantic, it has multiple meanings, it has a plurality of meaning. So therefore he says there is a passage, there is a shift, there is a transition from work, because when you say work, there is only one meaning. So there is a passage or a transition from work to text, because once you talk of a text has many meanings. And in this context, I would also talk of the essay by Foucault, What is an Author, where he talks about 4 author functions. And I'm sure those of you who have read this essay by Foucault, you remember the last line. The last line goes like this, like, what does it matter who is writing? So in other words, I am not interested in the author. I am not interested in the author's gender or this or that. What matters to us is the writing. Now, very interestingly, we think that this is a post-structuralist stance, the death of the author. No, it is not a post-structuralist stance alone. It has already been prefigured in the New Critics, because in 1946, Wimsatt and his friend, they came out with 2 essays, Intentional Fallacy and Effective Fallacy. So they have already talked about how going in search of the author's intention is a useless exercise, is a futile exercise, is a fallacy. Okay, so the fourth point is modern theory talks about the death of the author. Okay, now I am sure most of you or all of you have read the essay by Roland Barthes, The Death of the Author. Do you remember the last line? Okay, the last line goes like this. With the death of the author, we have the birth of the reader. So therefore, point number 5, modern theory or contemporary theory talks about the birth of the reader. In other words, I'm talking of the reader response school. So we have two schools almost around the same time. We have the American school. The title of the school is the Reader Response Theory, and that was spearheaded by a great man, a professor of English, Stanley Fish. And he is the author of Is There a Text in the Class? And on the other side, we have the German school. And the two important people attached to the German school are, the proponents of the German school are Hans Robert Jauss and Wolfgang Iser. Okay, so they talk about different categories of readers, different kinds of readers. So Stanley Fish talks of the I'm sorry, it is not Stanley Fish. I think there is a mistake. It is Iser, Wolfgang Iser, who talks of the implied reader. Then Judith Fetterly talks of the resisting reader. Then we have the real reader, the imaginary reader, the super reader, the ideal reader. In other words, the point is very simple. In traditional criticism, in classical criticism, the focus invariably was on the author, the creator, the poet, the playwright, the novelist, the short story writer, and the poor reader was ignored. The poor reader was given a short script. So nobody talked about the reader, nobody wrote about the reader, nobody wrote about the role played by the reader. So what mattered was the author and only the author. Now the reader response theory says, the reader also is important, almost as important as the author, because the author creates, the reader recreates. So in that sense, the reader is as much an author as Shakespeare is, or Jane Austen is, or Thomas Hardy is, or Jayakanthan is, or Balakumaran is. So the reader should not be dismissed. The reader plays a very important role. And there is an important Polish philosopher called Roman Ingarden, and it was he who gave the theoretical underpinnings for the reader response theory. Anyway, the theory is very clear. The reader matters a lot, because it is the reader who brings the story back to life. It is the reader who recreates, reformulates the story. So therefore, the reader is as important as the author. And this is the 5th point. The 6th point, I'll finish at 5:30. So the 6th point is modern theory critiques the canon. Okay, so what do we mean by canon? So the canon, there is a lot of discussion. If you look at the origin of the term canon, if you look at the source of the word canon, then we have to go back to the Bible, because the Bible, as we all know, is divided into the New Testament, 27 books, and the Old Testament. So if we ask the number of books in the Old Testament, you get 2 answers. If we ask the Catholics, the Catholic version, they will give you one number. They will tell you that there are 46 books. Whereas if we ask the Protestants, the Baptists, the Methodists, the Evangelicals, they would tell you there are 39 books. So which means 7 books, they are controversial. Okay, they are called apocryphal books, or they are called non-canonical. Anyway, let me not go into the biblical or the theological side. All that I want to emphasize is the word canon originally comes from the Bible, discussion of the Bible. Now, in literary parlance, in literary terminology, canon would mean a list of, or a compendium of, the best authors and the best books, great authors and great books, whether it is in Tamil or Hindi or Malayalam or English or French. So you take the Tamil canon. Who are the best writers in Tamil and what are their best works? So that would be the Tamil canon. You take the English canon. Who are the best authors? Okay, Shakespeare, Chaucer, Milton, T.S. Eliot, Matthew Arnold. So the best authors and the best books. Now the problem is the canon has some severe constraints, some severe limitations. Now, maybe later, particularly if you're a teacher, if you're a professor, you can do this exercise. I have done this exercise many times. You go to your own class, or when you're conducting a seminar, or when you're giving a talk on, let us say, post-colonialism or feminism, you can do this exercise. You randomly ask students or ask the audience to give you a list of 10 great authors or 20 great authors, and then you analyze the names. You will find out, to your surprise, and the audience also would find out to their surprise, that the list is largely male authors and white authors. Okay, so therefore, 4 points to be noted. Number one, the canon is androcentric, meaning most of the great authors, whether it is in French or German or English or Tamil, they happen to be men, androcentric, and it is not an accident. And most of the authors, most of the great authors, most of the great poets, most of the great novelists, they happen to be white-skinned, Eurocentric. And most of the authors, they are heterosexual. In other words, you would draw up a list of great authors, you would hardly find a homosexual, you would hardly find a lesbian. Okay, maybe you have poets like Audre Lorde and others. Okay, but in general, canon is homophobic. There is a phobia, there is a repulsion towards the homosexuals and the lesbians. In other words, they expect you, the heteronormativity is to be a heterosexual, and the great writers, they belong to the bourgeois class. You don't have any tribal writer, you have very few Dalit writers. So in other words, the canon is androcentric, Eurocentric, homophobic, and bourgeois, and therefore we have to rewrite, reformulate, and rework the canon. How to do it? Bill Ashcroft and his coevals, they say, you critique the parameters, and once you critique the parameters, once you revise the norms, once you change the yardsticks, then automatically the canon gets rewritten. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about it, so let me go to the last point. So the last point is modern theory or contemporary theory is against totalization. In other words, no more grand narratives, no more meta narratives, no more totalizing narratives. In the place of grand narratives, in the place of meta narratives, in the place of totalizing narratives, you have mini narratives or little narratives or provincial narratives. In other words, I'm talking of postmodernism, because it was Lyotard, Jean-Francois Lyotard, who in 1979 submitted a report on the status of knowledge the world over to the Canadian Council of Universities at Quebec. And it was the French version titled The Postmodern Condition, a Report on Knowledge, and the English version appeared in 1984, published by Manchester University Press. So Lyotard would give us the best definition of postmodernism: incredulity towards meta-narratives. In other words, to make it simple, suspicion of meta-narratives or death of meta-narratives. In other words, I'll give you two examples. Okay, I'll give you one example because there is not much time. Is feminism singular or plural? Can there be one feminism for the entire world? If you argue that there is only one single feminism for the entire world, whether it is North America or India or Africa, then you're talking of a meta-narrative, you're talking of a grand narrative, you're talking of a totalizing narrative. Instead, if you argue, no, feminism is not singular, it is plural. There are many different versions of feminism. There are many different brands of feminism. You have an American feminism, you have an Asian feminism, you have an African feminism, you have an Indian feminism. Within India, you have a Delhi brand, you have a Kolkata brand, you have a Chennai brand. Within Tamil Nadu, depending upon the socio-economic, political context, we have many versions. So this is what the seventh one talks about. In other words, let me conclude. Now that I have talked about the 7 points, the final question is, now people today talk of the end of theory. In fact, Terry Eagleton has a book and Doherty has a book. So the question is, are the days of theory over? Will theory become passé? Is it the end of the theory? Okay. Now the answer is certainly no, not because I like theory. Okay, you listen to Eagleton. This is what Eagleton has to say. He argues, if theory means a reasonably systematic reflection on our guiding assumptions, he says it remains as indispensable as ever. So which means theory will never become passé. So dear friends, that marks the end of my presentation. So in the first part of the presentation, what I did was I took you to the book by M.H. Abrams, The Mirror and the Lamp, the first chapter, Orientation of Critical Theories, where he talks about the four coordinates or the four pillars and the four corresponding theories. So you have the universe and the mimetic theory, you have the literary work and the formalistic theory, you have the author and the expressive theory, and you have the reader and the pragmatic theory. And I also talked about in the first section the five basic assumptions or underpinnings of traditional criticism, and I also laid out the passage or the shift or the transition from traditional criticism to modern criticism. I gave you 5 or 6 important landmarks, watershed moments. Then I talked about 7 major issues in modern theory, and I wrapped up my presentation with the question, will theory become passé? Will theory go out of circulation? Is it the end of the road for theory? Okay, the answer is certainly no. And before I say goodbye, I would like to give you a short list. Okay, so these are some of the important books. I am sure all of you are familiar with Peter Barry's Beginning Theory. Then Hans Burton's, that book also is good as Beginning Theory by Peter Barry. Then Jonathan Culler is a very short book, 115 to 120 pages. Then Eagleton, Literary Theory and Introduction, particularly the second edition. Then there is a recent book, not very recent though, by Mary Claggers, Literary Theory, A Guide for the Perplexed. The entire book is not brilliant, but some chapters are brilliant, particularly the chapter on postmodernism is brilliant. Then, of course, if you're an ardent, a die-hard fan of criticism, then you have the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism, and the general editor is Vincent B. Leach. Then you have a recent book, which is a good book, which is a collection of essays edited by Patricia Waugh, Literary Theory and Criticism, and Oxford Guide. Then you have Roger Webster, Studying Literary Theory and Introduction. I have also written a book, Interventions, Essays in Philosophy and Literary Theory, but it is not out of circulation. Copies have been sold out. I am thinking of a second edition. So dear friends, I said I will stop at 5:30. So now it is exactly 5:30. So let me stop. But before that, I would like to thank the principal, Dr. Christina Bridget, particularly, very specially, the head of the department, Reverend Dr. Judy Gomez, and the convener, Onita, for this wonderful opportunity to talk of literary theory, the classical perspective, and literary theory, the modern, the contemporary perspective. If I have inspired you to read a few literary texts, and if I have inspired you to change your thinking regarding literature, no, it is not difficult, it is only challenging, then I would have achieved my mission. So thank you very much. Wish you all the best. Goodbye.
Thank you,
Please
sir,
wait, sir.
for lending your valuable time and knowledge, which serves as a useful truth in our field of study. We feel so grateful for your patient and skillful presentation, which took us into a wide arena on literary theories and research. Gratitude is the music of the heart, when its chords are swept by the breeze of kindness. I now call upon Mrs. Gisha, Assistant Professor of English, to propose the word of thanks.
I will praise God's name in song and glorify him with thanksgiving. Psalm 69, verse 30. Gratitude is the most exquisite form of courtesy. A pleasant evening to one and all. Foremost, I thank the Almighty for his showers of blessings throughout the session. I extend my sense of gratitude to our resource person, Dr. A. Joseph Dorairaj, Professor and Dean, School of English and Foreign Languages, Gandhigram Rural Institute, Team to University, Dindigul, for his awe-inspiring presentation on literary theories from classical to modern. Thank you, sir. I am glad to
Thank you.
thank our secretary, Dr. Sister Niranjana Antoni Sami, for her constant support through her prayers. I am indeed honored to thank our principal, Dr. Sister Christina Bridget, for her encouraging words, which inspires us to reach greater heights. I specially thank Dr. Sister Judy Gomes, in charge Shift 2 and Head Department of English, for her guidance in organizing the webinar and her prayerful support for the success of the event. Thank you, dear sister. I appreciate the participants for taking the time to be here today for the program. I also thank the staff members of the Department of English for all the support rendered towards the success of the webinar. A special word of thanks to Ms. Shirley Deepak and Ms. Dharmi for helping us in live streaming the program. I also thank Ms. Rini Valentina for the technical support and Ms. Janani for her amazing job being the master of ceremony. Once again, I thank you.
Thank you, organizers, and congratulations, organizers. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am, for your warm words of gratitude. A single person's whistle can never make a symphony. It takes an whole orchestra to play a melody. With deep gratitude, I thank our chief guests, teachers, and English Literary Association members and the participants whose enthusiastic participation led to the success of today's webinar. I bid a joyful goodbye and ask the Almighty to shower His choicest blessings on each one of you. Once again, I thank you all. Note to the participants, you are requested to fill the feedback form posted on the chat box without fail. The certificates will be given to the participants who have filled in the feedback form. Thank you. Once again, I repeat, the participants are requested to fill the feedback form of today's webinar posted on the chat box without fail. The certificates will be awarded to the participants, those who have filled the feedback form. Thank you.
Post the feedback link, ma. Where they're asking for it.
It's posted, sister.
Thank you, sister. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, dear.
Thank you, sister. Thank you, Busha ma'am. Thank you, Anita ma'am.
Thank you, Janani.
Welcome, ma'am.